done. My dad was a minister, great-grandfather was a minister, uncle took over my spot when I left Altamont and so on. But as we get into Nehemiah, I want you to know this first and foremost. My education is not in biblical studies, okay? I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, or right now I'm a vice principal at Coffee County Middle School. This is my 27th year in education, so I am not a biblical scholar by no means. So teaching a class over Nehemiah especially has been a challenge for me, just trying to make sure I've got kind of not only a broad picture of everything, but also when questions arise, I'll be able to kind of hone in on some of the specifics that we have in Nehemiah and so on. So again, teaching, I think, is way harder than being a pulpit minister because I know what I'm going to say up here, but when I ask a question, I'm not sure what answer I'm going to get, so I kind of have to meander my way through sometimes when I teach. But I love to teach. Again, that's been my background for almost all my adult life. All right. So that's my introduction to myself. So let's talk about Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah is in the almost middle of the Old Testament section of our Bibles. So my first question, this kind of goes back to my educational background. This is called a KWL chart. If I had a chart up here, I'd have a K, a W, and an L divided up into three sections. And so the first question, and this will kind of help guide me as we look at the next few weeks on Nehemiah, is what do you know about Nehemiah? Because I don't want to spend 45 minutes on a part of Nehemiah when most of you all know that already. That's one of the downfalls of teaching sometimes is we'll get a lesson plan and we'll teach for maybe 2 or 3 days and 90% of the class already knows it. So you've kind of wasted your time because they already know that. So what do you know about Nehemiah? And I'm going to write these down, by the way, so I don't repeat myself. He wanted to rebuild the wall. Yes, that's kind of I think the main thing he's known for is he wanted to rebuild the wall. But again, I can't spend 13 weeks on rebuilding the wall. Good.
In the beginning, he kind of came back from the exile.
Yep.
People came from the exile.
Yep, came from the exile. Right. Yep. He's a cupbearer, correct? What else about Nehemiah? Rebuild the wall. He came back from the exile. He was a cupbearer.
It's not only he, but all the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With the exception of a few.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And here's the thing about Nehemiah. If you want to know who all came back, there's a list of them in there. Now, you may have to use the Bible app in order to pronounce those. Phonics really didn't work for me in first grade, I'm sorry to say. Here's the funny part for my education is phonics didn't really work for me. And then I became a principal and got into administration where I had to observe teachers teaching phonics to their kids. And so I've kind of learned phonics because now I've had to teach Caden. Well, here's these rules, You got the sneaky E, so if there's a consonant E, you got to move it, and it makes the vowel say its name. Anyway, so yes, there is a list of them. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the names because we don't really know much about them. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and I think we're going to see that relationship kind of plays a part in the story of Nehemiah. We sometimes think of a cupbearer as simply someone that just like a server. You go to a restaurant and you got a person come out and gives you a cup. Well, back then, there was people didn't like their kings, and so they'd want to try to poison them sometimes. And so a cupbearer was a pretty important. Sadly, you could die, but it was a very, very important. The king had to trust that person in order for him not to be killed with poison. And so Nehemiah does, it's a pretty significant role. Yes?
Did that cupbearer have to test things first? Am I confused with that?
From my understanding, yes. They had to test it first. And of course, I'd say more than likely, he had to do it in front of the king so that the king would know. Yeah, because then, the cupbearer could actually put poison into the cup as well. So you did have to, I think that's why it was such a big position at the time. And was, golly, you look at world history, cupbearers were kind of known for a long time, even probably into the English monarchy and stuff. Anything else about Nehemiah? That I can think of. Yes?
Even from the first verse, he acknowledges, one, we have sinned.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, you are God,
Mm-hmm.
and you are our only hope.
Yep, very good. Yes. Yes, this first, like I said, the first chapter goes in, it really shows Nehemiah's character and how he understands what Judah or Israel, I'll use the term Israel even though these exiles are from Judah. He kind of realized what had happened. And now that there were people going back to Jerusalem, he realizes that God's the only one that can help this situation, in the situation that they're in. Okay? If you think of something else, feel free to add to this list. So my next question, in kind of the KWL chart mentality, what do you want to know about Nehemiah? What would you like to know about Nehemiah?
I assume he was a prophet. What else? Some of the prophets, he,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had that ability to, yeah.
did different things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yes. Good. Yeah, I'm glad you want to learn that, because that's technically set for next week, but if time permits, we'll get started in that actually today. What else would you like to know about Nehemiah?
Yes, sir.
Okay, why him?
Why him?
Mhm.
Why give up somewhat comfortable to go back and rebuild his road?
Yeah,
That's not inviting.
right.
Doesn't sound real inviting job, does it?
It really doesn't, especially in the first chapter when, he basically is told what's happening. Yeah. Yeah, why him?
I'd
Alan,
like to know
you're
the
saying?
beginning and the end.
Uh-huh.
Who was the influence? Why him?
Right.
And at the end, what did he accomplish?
Right.
The wall, but was
Right.
there anything else?
Correct.
After?
Yes, uh-huh. Yeah, very much. Anything else? What would you like to know about Nehemiah? Yes. The different walls. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. It was, as I was studying this, there's one, I think it's in chapter 3. I think it's in my notes here. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's like 12 references to gates in this book. And of course, I'm knowing Nehemiah as he builds this wall. And then I'm reading, I think it's in chapter 3, maybe 5, that there's like these 12 gates. And I'm like, why do you got so many openings in this wall? I couldn't figure that out. And so I do have a map of what they think the walls were and where they were kind of located on that kind of ridge or that mountain. If you kind of get this, and I had to figure this out a little bit when I was studying the book of Acts, that there was one time when Paul, I think it's Paul, makes a statement, I have to go up to Jerusalem. And where he's at, he's north of Jerusalem. And I'm like, wait a minute, why is he in another place? I don't understand why he says I got to go up to Jerusalem when he's already north of Jerusalem. And what it is, he's talking about elevation. And so, yes. And so when you read about I think it's the Kidron Valley and things like that, I think, Elijah, ran to well, that's the valley from off of the hill that Jerusalem's on. And the map that I have, and I actually have it with me if you want to look at it, but it kind of depicts where they think the wall was, and even some of the gates that I was referring to in reference to how it looks topographically and so on. So we will get into that area of the wall, because in this book, we find out that he kind of makes an inspection. He kind of walks around the ruins of the wall kind of before he gets into the rebuilding of it. And we'll talk a little bit about that as far as leadership and assessment of situations and so on. We're going to get into that as well in this. What else? Nehemiah.
I thought chapter 5, it's putting the vernacular of today.
Mm-hmm.
You're ripping us off.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. There is that idea of chapter 5 is the Jews were not, and I'm going to use the word Jews. This is, well, up until kind of the time right before the exile, right before the destruction of Jerusalem and so on, most of the Bible will refer to people as Hebrews, and this particular book especially, you will see the term Jewish. That's kind of a shift during that time in history, in which like I said, you talk about the Hebrews, with the children of Israel in Egypt. It talks about the Hebrew children. Well, when we study Nehemiah, you'll see that word Jew or Jewish quite a bit in there. But yeah, they weren't treating themselves very well. They weren't treating each other very well. And so yeah, they were kind of ripping each other off. And Nehemiah has to call them on that. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, if you've read chapter 5, it's pretty obvious what's going on. So yeah, we will discuss that too as well. All right, so let's ask another question. So Nehemiah is, like I said, in the middle of the Old Testament as far as the books of the Old Testament, okay? Why is studying Nehemiah important? Now, don't say because it's in the Bible. That's a given. I'm taking that one away from you. Why is studying Nehemiah important? I mean, it's the Old Testament book. It's not about the kings. Okay. Should be pointing us to Christ. That's a very good point. Very, very good point, actually.
More than just the wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the things that he had to endure,
Mm-hmm.
the way he encouraged,
Mm-hmm.
the way he protected,
Mm-hmm.
the way he persevered.
Yep.
The wall, my explanation, the wall is just a small part of it.
It really is.
And that's kind of where, I think in church today, that we get fixated on one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Many churches focus on, got to build the building, wall, the building,
Yeah.
and things crumble apart on the inside.
Yeah.
Seeing churches focus so much on, might be community outreach, and
Mm-hmm.
things fall apart on the inside.
Mhm.
building the wall. He
Yeah.
doesn't forsake people,
Mhm.
or forsake the church.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, go ahead. Barry. Restoration. Okay. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Restoration is another very, very good point. And one of the things when it comes to, as Gary was saying, Nehemiah, you can look at like his place in history, which we will, but we can't overlook his characteristic as well. One, as was said in chapter 1, just that, you know, he acknowledges that, you know, there's only one God, that Israel has sinned, there's only one God, and God's the only hope that Israel has. But that you look at Nehemiah, and we'll look at this throughout this study, we will look at his leadership skills. I mean, he didn't, I mean, as I said earlier, he'll actually secretly one night, he'll walk around the ruins of the wall before he even begins to tell everyone, okay, here's what we need to do. I mean, he kind of assesses the situation. He assesses it for himself. He doesn't necessarily take the words of others. He as a leader, he'll go in and he'll kind of assess this situation. We'll look at the influence he had, the motivation, the encouraging of others. It's not just architecturally his leadership, but then because of the situation they're in, with outside forces wanting to stop the construction of the wall, he has to look at, as far as his military and his defensive type of understanding of how can we get this wall built in order to protect us, but how can we protect us while we build the wall in order to protect us? So there's a lot of things that Nehemiah and his character and just his leadership ability, I do want to talk about that a little bit more as we go through this study too. Because as Gary said, sometimes, you ask, in kids' class, well, what do we know about Nehemiah? Well, he rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem. And that's great and all. But I think as we get into these 13 chapters, you're going to see a lot of things in which, as was said, we can use this as a means of, there's going to be things that oppress us. There's going to be things that try to stop us from our ultimate goal, and that is doing what God wants us to do. And there'll be times when we fail, but at the same time, we got to keep our eyes on Christ, as was said earlier. So yeah, that'll be kind of where we're at for these next few weeks when we study Nehemiah. All right, so one of the things I wanted to discuss today was I wanted to kind of paint a picture as to what's going on in the world today. Let me go back for just a minute. Not today. Y'all know what's going on in the world today. I meant back then. But let me go back before I get into that. This has been a little bit of a, not conflict. I've had to really kind of stop one thought in my head and go to another, because in I guess y'all refer to it as the fall quarter, on Wednesday night, I'll be doing a study on Isaiah. Well, I didn't really put everything into perspective until as I was studying Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, as was said, this is the story of when they come back from exile, right? And just kind of a quick question, where are they coming back from as far as who has conquered them? the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, and so on. So you've got Nebuchadnezzar. They destroyed Judah, Jerusalem. They are in captivity. This is where we get the story of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar, you have the eating of the food. You have the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. You have Nebuchadnezzar like almost being like a wild animal. That story of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel is really weird. But then as you read Daniel, you'll also see the transition of the Babylonian Empire being destroyed by the Persian Empire, or the Medes and Persians, that thing. And so what's interesting about Nehemiah is if you want to look at 3 books of the Old Testament, and they're pretty quick reads. Again, some of them have lists of names like Nehemiah, so it somewhat is beneficial maybe to listen to it as well. That way you're not just kind of toning out when it gets to these lists of names. But Ezra, in the New Testament, Ezra actually is before Nehemiah when it comes to chronological order in time. Okay, so if you've not ever done this, basically Ezra will lead a group first. There's actually 3 different, I could say Exodus, but there's 3 different groups that come back from exile. Ezra is one of them, and then Nehemiah, we know as far as the biblical history, he'll be the last of the group that comes back. Now, Esther is basically kind of in the middle of those 2 books chronologically, even though, again, in the Old Testament it's Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, but Esther is actually in between those 2 books. So if you ever want to kind of chronologically look at it, you could read Ezra, then you could read Esther, and then you could read Nehemiah. It kind of gives you a little bit of idea of what's going on chronologically. Now, what's interesting to me that kind of got me really excited about studying Nehemiah and trying to get more of the in-depth part of Nehemiah, not just the broader sense. When you look at the Old Testament and you have your list of your books that's in your Bible, almost every Bible, unless you have a chronological Bible, looks like this. You got Genesis and you got all the way to Malachi, and then it starts Matthew and so on. Well, they compose almost all Bibles in subject matters. You got your first 5 books of Moses, and you've got the Kings and all that. Then you've got your poetry. Then you got your prophets, Isaiah through Malachi. And I've got a chart that I want to share with you about this. But almost all of those prophets, Isaiah to Malachi, chronologically, they all happened before Nehemiah. And so, you read Nehemiah, maybe read Esther, and then you read about, okay, here's Isaiah and Jeremiah, and there are all these prophesying and so on. Well, the events have already occurred. And so what's very interesting to me about Nehemiah is there's I think maybe 1 or 2 prophets after that. And even that's a little bit questionable. But when you get to the end of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, as far as history goes, we don't know much more at all about the nation of Israel until the angel comes to Zacharias and we see John the Baptist come onto the scene. So we've always heard about these 400 years between the testaments, Old Testament, New Testament. Well, it's not 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. It's really, it's hovering around the end of Nehemiah and Matthew. And so as we look through Nehemiah and we see about him organizing the government, I think it's 1/10 of all the families are going to live inside the city, and the rest of you can live outside and so on. But we've got to solidify, Jerusalem. what does that, why is that important? What does all that entail? And then Israel goes 400 years from this point until John the Baptist comes on the scene. And so I felt like, as I was reading this and looking at it, again, I felt like that was a very interesting take on that. As we get to the end of this book, that's kind of all we know about the history of Israel, biblically speaking. Now, again, we can look at world history and so on, because there's a lot of stuff. You've got the Greeks, and you got the Romans. That'll all come in within those 400 years, and so on. So, again, that's something else we'll look at. All right. What else is going on in the world during Nehemiah? Again, we've got the major empires of the world that world history talks about. You had the Egyptian dynasty, and we read about that with Moses and so on. Then you have Israel and the greatness of David and Solomon and so on. And of course it divides up and all that. Then you have the Assyrian. Now, we're not really going to get into the Assyrian Empire. Now, we will get into the Assyrian Empire a lot when we study Israel. Then you have the Babylonians, which most of us know about the Babylonians because of the book of Daniel. And then after that, you have the Persian Empire, which you'll read that in the book of Daniel. And you'll read this here in Nehemiah, because you'll see Cyrus. And then after the Persian Empire, you'll have Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. And then lastly, they'll be conquered by the Romans, and that's where you get the story of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Octavius, all those type of things. And that's the empire, as almost everybody in here knows, is who is in charge of the world, so to speak, when Jesus comes to this earth. Okay, so that's kind of so the Greek Empire is kind of starting up a lot, and that's where most of our famous historians are happening during this time. This is around, again, some suggest about 400 to 500 BC. So this is about 400 to 500 years before Christ comes on the scene. And we have, you probably heard of this person, Hippocrates, where we get the Hippocratic Oath. He is during the time of Nehemiah. He is a physician at, I think it's Kos, C-O-S. Again, that's kind of around the Greek area. You have a gentleman by the name of Pericles. Pericles historically is a very famous minister of Athens. I mean, he was a Greek mythology, minister, not like a Christian or Jewish minister, but he was like a Greek mythology type person. The last two, most of y'all probably know. Plato was around during Nehemiah's time, the great poet, the great Greek poet. But then also Socrates. Socrates, the philosopher, that's who was around during Nehemiah's time. So again, you've got this biblical history happening of the city of Jerusalem being restored after decades of being in exile, and at the same time you've got the Greek states that are kind of getting together, which they will eventually take over the Persian Empire here in just, maybe 100 years or so. And at that time, Jerusalem is still trying to rebuild itself. So that's kind of what's going on in the world as Nehemiah is trying to rebuild this wall. Okay? Any other questions before we kind of get into... Yes? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it is very odd. And some have suggested that the queen that is mentioned here with the king is Esther. Now, I've read commentaries that counter that, but there are some that suggest when Nehemiah comes and asks, "Can I go back?" it says the queen was there. Some suggest it is Queen Esther that is there. But again, I've read commentaries that say differently on that. But yes, it is unusual. The gentleman that you trust with your life, because he's the one testing your drink to make sure it's not poison. And it sounds like, and the way it sounds, it was that time of year. So some suggest that maybe there were different cupbearers, like maybe every quarter, or I don't know how they organized it. But it was, he knew Nehemiah, but again, and then some suggest he trusted him so much. That's why he said, "Well, when are you going to come back?" Okay, yeah, I'll let you go. When are you going to come back to me? So yeah, very, very interesting, those two things. Yeah, very, very much so. All right. So we've got about 8, 9 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, gotcha. So what brought us here? What brought us to Nehemiah and the children of Israel coming from exile from Babylon? So kind of what brought us to this point. I don't want to go too much into it, because again, in a few months, I'll be talking about Isaiah, and Isaiah, the chart I have, there's like 8 different kings, or 7 kings after Isaiah's prophecy, before we have the destruction or before we have the conquest of Judah. So I try not to make sure that I'm not going to bore you with this how we got here. So the question I want to get into, just as to transition into next week, is how do we get from the kings of Israel, right, the kings of Israel and Judah, to Persia? Because here in the first chapter of Nehemiah, it talks about, it came to pass in the month of, I think it's Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel. Now, some suggest that Shushan was kind of like either a winter residence, or, and I've had 2 different commentaries talk about this, the Persians were really into like how a person is buried, how they're almost like how it's kind of like the Egyptians with the pyramids, and how how their pharaohs were buried, and everything was so elaborate and elegant and so on. Well, some suggest the Persians were very much similar to that, in which they really wanted to make sure that when they died, that they just had the most elegant and the most elaborate, basically mausoleum, or whatever you want to call it. And some suggest that this Shushan is kind of where the Persian kings made their residence at when they were trying to tell people how to get their burial place set up. And so when Nehemiah suggests that, he's so distraught because his father's, homeland is in ruins, that affects King Cyrus, because he understands what it's like to make sure that a burial place is very, very important. So again, another connection between Nehemiah and this Persian king. So for those of you that know kind of Jewish history, so how did we get to the kings to Persia? Summarize that for us. How do we get from kings? How do we get from like Hezekiah, the great king that we know of near the end, Hezekiah, to Persia? I told you as a teacher, we had to train ourselves to make sure that 3 to 5 seconds of silence is okay. So I don't mean to make it. I don't mean to make it sound complicated. We'll get a little more in depth next week. So, anybody know the son? Well, Hezekiah, for example. And we'll get into this in a few months, so maybe you'll forget this and it won't be a repeat. Hezekiah, if you remember, he's famous for basically he was told he was going to die. He prayed. 15 years was added to his life and so on. And he was always known as a good king, someone that was good in the eyes of God. But he did something wrong, and Isaiah had to get on to him for it. Does anybody know what that was? He showed somebody something. Yes. He showed the treasures. There was this envoy that came down, and he showed all the treasures, like of his house and everything. And Isaiah's like, well, who were those people? Anybody remember where they were from? Y'all actually answered the question. They came and took all those treasures. They were from Babylon. Now, during that time, the Assyrians were the main empire. But there was this envoy from Babylon that came, and Hezekiah's like, oh, yeah, let me show you what all we got. Isaiah says, they're going to come and take all this from you. Not from you, but it will eventually be taken. And so, you know, Isaiah has Manasseh. Manasseh was not a good king. I think you have Josiah after that. I'm not for sure. I may be in the wrong order. But if you remember, Josiah was very young. But in the story of the kings, they're renovating the temple. And the chief priest like, hey, we found the book of the law. It's like, we didn't know about this. And Josiah's like, what have we done? And so we have all that happening, and I'll get into the specifics later. But unfortunately, during all that time, the Assyrian Empire is raging in the north, and they're coming and they're conquering lands north of Judah. As most of you know, they will capture Israel. And as we study Isaiah, we'll see that in great detail, and that they are trying to capture Egypt. And what I've discovered is that, you know, Jerusalem is in like a little mountain area, and so Assyria was over here. They had kind of already taken over Babylon, and now they were going down kind of the coast because that's where they could travel faster, and they were going to take over Egypt. And then they would just bring their forces together and basically take over, you know, Judah and everything else, and down to what's now the Persian Gulf. So you got all those things going on, and of course Assyria will eventually, and again I don't know the exact. Well, I do know how this happens. Assyria will lose. How many did they lose? Assyria would lose about 185,000 troops in one night. In one night. And it basically says, an angel of the Lord, and I was on, you know, it wasn't TikTok, I don't do TikTok. But someone posed this question. If Christ could have called for 12 legions of angels, and if in Isaiah an angel, singular, of the Lord was able to destroy 185,000 people, if you multiply those numbers, I don't know if there was that many people in the world during that time. It was a very interesting calculation to do that. If each of those 12 legions, each angel of those 12 legions could destroy 185,000 people. very staggering what could happen. Anyway, side note. Well, once that happens in history, then the Babylonians will start gaining power. And then they'll start sweeping east and so on. I'm out of time. I know the bell's not going to ring, but it's going to ring any second now. So what I want to do next week is we are going to look a lot at 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, because I want to show you one of the prophecies that are basically, as was said in the beginning. Nehemiah says, we have sinned. We have sinned, and you're our only hope. And so I want to get into next week what the children of Israel had done and what took them, what God was like, I'm sorry, I've had enough. I'm going to destroy Jerusalem. But there was always that hope. And so we'll get into that as well for next week. Okay. That's the bell. Y'all are dismissed, and we'll come back together here in just a few moments. Thank you all.
Really, I think it's interesting that we talk about all the sins of the Jewish people all the time.
Yeah.
But the opposite of that is also true. There were Jewish people that ended up exiled in other ways.
Right.
That became the leaders of all the countries. Joseph is in Egypt.
Yep.
Look at Esther.
Yep.
When you look at all these countries, all of a sudden there's a Jewish person rises to the top. Daniel. It's like, it's kind of interesting that God's influence on all of these countries. And it kind of starts with a tragedy, but if you'll be patient,
Yes.
it has a great outcome.
It does. It really, really does. It's
So,
really
and that was
amazing.
kind of an individual thing more than
Well, the group.
yeah.
But yes,
I find that all interesting that God sent these people probably not where they wanted to go,
Exactly.
and they did with God's help. They did great things.
Yep. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Thanks, Jasper. Appreciate it.
Unless somebody signed up on the sheet, I
have this today?
No, but Jackson's not here, so it's Miss. Wait, I know Mr. Weeks doing it.
It is. Be quiet.
Or G.
Probably need to get that